Marco Santini pushed the plate away with disgust. The expensive pasta dish scattered across the white tablecloth as the crystal wine glass toppled over, staining the fabric red like blood. The entire restaurant fell silent. Every waiter, every customer, every chef in the kitchen held their breath. "This is garbage," Marco announced loudly, his voice carrying the authority that came with being Vincent Santini's only son. Vincent Santini controlled half the city's underground operations, and everyone knew it. "I wouldn't feed this to my dog." The restaurant manager rushed over, sweat beading on his forehead. "Mr. Santini, please, let us prepare something else. Anything you want." Marco stood up, his 6-foot frame towering over the trembling manager. His expensive Italian suit was perfectly pressed, his dark hair slicked back, and his cold gray eyes showed no emotion. At 28, he had never worked a day in his life, never wanted for anything, and never found a meal that satisfied him. "I've eaten at every restaurant in this city," Marco said, straightening his gold watch. "They're all the same. Tasteless, boring, pathetic." He had spoken the truth. For the past 5 years, Marco had made it his mission to find the perfect meal. He visited the most expensive restaurants, hired private chefs from around the world, and even flew to Italy to eat at his grandmother's favorite places. Nothing worked. Every dish tasted like cardboard to him. Food had become his biggest disappointment. His bodyguard, Tony, stepped forward. "Boss, your father is expecting you at the warehouse in an hour." Marco nodded and pulled out a thick roll of cash. He threw $500 on the ruined tablecloth without looking at the amount. "For the mess," he said coldly. As they walked toward the exit, the other diners whispered behind their hands. Some recognized him from newspaper photos. Others had heard stories about the Santini family's reputation. Marco ignored them all. He was used to the stares, the whispers, the fear in people's eyes. Outside the restaurant, his black Mercedes waited with the engine running. Tony held the door open as Marco slid into the leather back seat. The driver, an older man named Sal, who had worked for the family for 20 years, glanced in the rearview mirror. "Where to, Mr. Marco?" "Just drive," Marco replied, loosening his tie. "I need to think." The city blurred past the tinted windows as they drove through the busy streets. Marco stared out at the people walking on the sidewalks. They looked happy, content with their simple lives. He envied them sometimes. They could enjoy a simple sandwich or a cup of coffee. For Marco, even the finest caviar tasted like nothing. His phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Stop playing with your food and get to work. We have business to discuss." Marco smiled grimly. His father thought his obsession with finding good food was a waste of time. Vincent Santini was a practical man who cared only about money and power. He ate whatever was put in front of him without complaint. Food was fuel, nothing more. But Marco was different. Maybe it was because he had grown up with everything handed to him, or maybe it was because he was searching for something real in a world full of fake people and false promises. Food was supposed to bring pleasure, comfort, satisfaction. For him, it brought only disappointment. "Turn here," Marco suddenly told Sal. They were in a part of the city he rarely visited, where the buildings were older and the people worked with their hands for a living. Small shops lined the narrow streets, and the smell of different cuisines mixed in the air. "You sure about this neighborhood, boss?" Tony asked, his hand instinctively moving to the gun under his jacket. Marco ignored the question. Something had caught his eye. A small diner squeezed between a laundromat and a shoe repair shop. The sign above the door was faded and cracked, reading Mama Rosa's Kitchen in peeling red letters. Through the window, he could see a few customers eating at mismatched tables and chairs. "Stop here," Marco ordered. Tony frowned. "Boss, this place looks like a health code violation waiting to happen." "I said stop." The Mercedes pulled over, and Marco stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk. The smell hit him immediately. Something was cooking inside that diner, something that smelled different from all the fancy restaurants he had visited. It wasn't the artificial aroma of expensive spices or imported ingredients. It was simple, honest, and somehow familiar. He pushed open the diner's door and a small bell jingled overhead. The interior was exactly what he expected. Worn linoleum floors, red vinyl booths with duct tape covering the tiers, and fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally. The walls were covered with old family photos and handwritten thank you notes from customers. A few people looked up as he entered. Marco knew he stood out in his expensive suit among the construction workers and taxi drivers who frequented this place. But for once, he didn't care about appearances. Behind the counter, an elderly woman with gray hair tied in a neat bun smiled at him. "Welcome to Mama Rosa's, honey. Sit anywhere you like." Marco chose a booth near the window and studied the simple plastic menu. The prices were incredibly low compared to what he usually paid for meals. Hamburgers for $6, spaghetti and meatballs for $8, meatloaf dinner for $7.50. It all seemed too basic, too ordinary. "What can I get you started with?" a voice asked. Marco looked up and saw a young woman standing beside his table with a notepad in her hand. She was probably in her early 20s, with brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and kind green eyes. Her uniform was clean but well worn, and she had a genuine smile that didn't seem forced or fake. "What's good here?" Marco asked, genuinely curious for the first time in months. The waitress, whose name tag read Elena, tilted her head thoughtfully. "Well, that depends on what you're in the mood for. Mama Rosa makes everything fresh. Her meatloaf is really popular, and the chicken soup is perfect for a cold day like today." Marco studied Elena's face as she spoke. She wasn't trying to impress him or sell him the most expensive item on the menu. She was simply being helpful, treating him like any other customer. "I'll have the meatloaf," Marco decided. "Good choice. Mashed potatoes or fries with that?" "Mashed potatoes." Elena wrote down his order and turned to leave, then paused. "Can I ask you something? You look like you're not from around here." Marco tensed slightly. Usually, when people recognized him or figured out who he was, they either became terrified or tried to use the connection for their own benefit. "What makes you say that?" Elena smiled again. "Your suit probably costs more than I make in 3 months, and you're carrying yourself like someone who's never had to wait for anything in his life. But you chose to eat here instead of some fancy place uptown. That's curious." Her honesty surprised him. Most people either feared him or tried to flatter him. Elena was simply observing and stating facts without judgment. "Maybe I'm tired of fancy places," Marco replied. "Well, you've come to the right spot then. Mama Rosa's is about as unfancy as it gets. But the food is made with love, and sometimes that's worth more than expensive ingredients." As Elena walked away to place his order, Marco found himself watching her. She moved efficiently between tables, chatting with regular customers, refilling coffee cups, and helping Mama Rosa behind the counter. There was something peaceful about the way she worked, something genuine that he rarely encountered in his world. 20 minutes later, Elena returned with his plate. The meatloaf was thick and brown, covered in a simple gravy. The mashed potatoes were fluffy and butter-colored, and green beans completed the meal. It looked like something his grandmother might have made, if he had ever known his grandmother. Marco cut into the meatloaf and took his first bite. The flavor was ordinary. Simple ground beef, breadcrumbs, onions, and seasonings. Nothing fancy or exotic. But as he chewed, something strange happened. The taste didn't disappoint him. It didn't excite him either, but it didn't leave him feeling empty and frustrated like every other meal had for years. He took another bite, then another. The mashed potatoes were creamy and real, not the artificial fluff he was used to. The green beans were slightly overcooked, but they tasted like actual vegetables instead of expensive garnish. Elena appeared beside his table again. "How is everything?" Marco looked up at her, genuinely puzzled by his own reaction. It's fine," she laughed. "Fine? That's not exactly a glowing review." "No, you don't understand," Marco said, setting down his fork. Fine is good. Fine is better than anything I've had in years." Elena raised an eyebrow. "You must eat at some pretty terrible places." "Actually, I eat at the best places money can buy, and they all taste like nothing to me." For a moment, Elena looked confused. Then understanding crossed her face. "Oh, you're one of those people who have tried everything and can't find anything that satisfies them anymore. My brother went through something like that when he came back from the army. Nothing tasted right to him for months." Marco hadn't thought about it that way. He had always assumed his problem was with the food itself, not with him. "What happened to your brother?" "He had to start over. Simple food, simple flavors. Gradually worked his way back up to enjoying meals again. Took almost a year, but he got there." As Marco continued eating, he found himself actually finishing the entire plate. When was the last time he had eaten a complete meal without pushing it away in disgust? He couldn't remember. Elena brought him coffee without being asked, the kind that came from a regular coffee maker, not an expensive espresso machine. It was strong and hot and perfectly ordinary. "Can I ask you something else?" Elena said as she refilled his cup. Marco nodded, curious about what she would say next. "What do you do for work? You have the look of someone who doesn't get his hands dirty, but you're not soft like most rich guys who come in here." Marco almost choked on his coffee. How could he tell her that he was the son of the city's most powerful crime boss? That his work involved collecting debts, intimidating business owners, and making sure his father's illegal operations ran smoothly? "Family business," he said finally. "What kind of family business?" "Import and export." It wasn't entirely a lie. The Santini family did import and export various goods, though most of them were illegal, and none of them were handled through legitimate customs channels. Elena nodded, apparently satisfied with his vague answer. "Well, whatever you do, you should smile more. You've got nice teeth, but you look like you're angry at the world most of the time." Marco touched his face unconsciously. When was the last time someone had told him to smile? When was the last time he had felt like smiling about anything? His phone buzzed again. Another text from his father, this one more urgent. Marco sighed and pulled out his wallet. "I have to go," he said, leaving a $20 bill on the table for an $8 meal. Elena picked up the money and looked at him with raised eyebrows. "This is way too much." "Keep it." "I can't take a tip that's bigger than your meal. Mama Rosa would have my head." Marco stood up and adjusted his jacket. "Then don't tell her." As he reached the door, Elena called out, "Hey, what's your name?" Marco paused with his hand on the door handle. In his world, names were dangerous things. Knowing the wrong name could get you killed. But looking back at Elena's open, honest face, he found himself answering. "Marco." "Well, Marco, thanks for stopping by. Come back anytime. Maybe next time try the chicken soup. It's even better than the meatloaf." Marco stepped out into the cold afternoon air and climbed back into his Mercedes. As Sal pulled away from the curb, Marco found himself looking back at the small diner until it disappeared around a corner. "How was the food, boss?" Tony asked. Marco was quiet for a long moment, still tasting the simple meatloaf and mashed potatoes. "It was fine," he said finally. Tony frowned. "Just fine? So we won't be coming back here?" Marco stared out the window at the city passing by, thinking about Elena's smile and her suggestion that he try the chicken soup next time. For the first time in years, he was actually looking forward to his next meal. 3 days passed before Marco returned to Mama Rosa's kitchen. He had tried to stay away, telling himself that one decent meal was just a fluke. But every restaurant he visited during those 3 days brought back the same old disappointment. The food tasted like expensive cardboard, and he found himself thinking about Elena's promise that the chicken soup was even better than the meatloaf. This time, he came alone. Tony and Sal waited in the Mercedes, parked down the street, while Marco walked into the small diner wearing jeans and a simple black sweater instead of his usual expensive suits. He hoped to blend in better, though his gold watch and Italian leather shoes still marked him as someone from a different world. The bell jingled as he entered, and Mama Rosa looked up from behind the counter. She was stirring a large pot of something that smelled incredible, and her face broke into a warm smile when she saw him. "You're back," she said in accented English, her voice carrying the warmth of someone's grandmother. "Elena said you might come back for the chicken soup." Marco slid into the same booth he had occupied 3 days earlier. "She recommended it." "Elena has good taste. That soup, it's my grandmother's recipe from the old country. I make it the same way for 40 years. When Elena appeared at his table, Marco felt an unexpected sense of relief. She looked exactly the same as he remembered. Ponytail, green eyes, genuine smile. In his world, people changed quickly. They disappeared, they betrayed each other, they died. Elena's consistency felt like something solid he could hold on to. "Back for round 2?" she asked, sliding into the seat across from him without being invited. It was a bold move that would have gotten anyone else in serious trouble, but somehow it felt natural. "You said the chicken soup was better than the meatloaf." "I did say that, but I should warn you it's addictive. We have customers who come in every day just for that soup." Elena signaled to Mama Rosa, who ladled a generous portion into a large bowl. When it arrived at Marco's table, the aroma hit him immediately. Rich chicken broth, tender vegetables, homemade noodles, and herbs that had been simmered together for hours. Marco took his first spoonful and closed his eyes. The flavor was complex but comforting, warm and satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with expensive ingredients or fancy preparation. It tasted like safety, like home, like all the things his actual home had never provided. "Good?" Elena asked, watching his reaction carefully. "Better than good," Marco admitted. "How does Mama Rosa do it?" "Love," Elena said simply. "I know that sounds cheesy, but it's true. She treats every bowl like she's feeding her own family. That makes a difference." As Marco ate, Elena told him about the diner. Mama Rosa had opened it 30 years ago after her husband died, using his life insurance money to buy the small space. She had worked 7 days a week for decades, building a loyal customer base of working-class people who appreciated honest food at fair prices. "What about you?" Marco asked. "How long have you worked here?" 2 years. I started right after high school. I'm saving money for college." "What do you want to study?" Elena's face lit up. "Nursing. I want to help people, you know? Make a difference in their lives when they're at their worst moments." Marco found himself genuinely interested in her dreams and plans. In his world, people didn't talk about helping others or making differences. They talked about money, territory, and revenge. Elena's optimism was foreign to him, but also refreshing. "What about you?" Elena asked. "Do you enjoy the import-export business?" Marco almost laughed. Enjoy wasn't the word he would use to describe collecting gambling debts and intimidating shop owners who were behind on their protection payments. "It's complicated. Most worthwhile things are. But you seem like someone who's looking for something he hasn't found yet." Elena's observation was more accurate than she knew. Marco had been looking for something his entire life, though he had never been able to name what it was. Purpose, maybe. Satisfaction. Peace. Something real in a world full of lies and violence. "Can I ask you something?" Marco said. "Aren't you curious about why someone like me eats in a place like this?" Elena shrugged. "People eat where they want to eat. Maybe you're tired of pretentious places where they charge $50 for a tiny piece of fish you can't even pronounce. Maybe you're looking for something authentic. Or maybe you just stumbled in here by accident and discovered that sometimes the best things come in unexpected packages. Marco finished his soup and found himself wishing the bowl was larger. For the first time in years, he actually wanted more food instead of pushing it away half-eaten. "Same time tomorrow?" Elena asked as she cleared his bowl. Marco hesitated. Coming here once had been curiosity. Coming here twice was a coincidence. Coming here 3 times would be a pattern, and patterns in his line of work could be dangerous. "I don't know if I can," he said honestly. "Well, if you do decide to come back, try the pot roast on Thursdays. Mama Rosa only makes it once a week, and it's incredible." That night, Marco lay in his king-sized bed in his expensive penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling. The apartment was decorated with the finest furniture money could buy, but it felt cold and empty. He thought about Mama Rosa's warm kitchen and Elena's easy conversation. He thought about the way the chicken soup had made him feel satisfied instead of frustrated. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed his father's name. "Marco, where have you been?" "Tony said you've been disappearing for hours at a time." "Just driving around, thinking about what?" "We have business to handle. The Morettis are moving in on our territory again, and I need you focused." The Morettis were a rival family that had been testing the Santini's boundaries for months. Normally, Marco would have been eager to handle the situation with violence and intimidation, but tonight, the thought of hurting people seemed exhausting. "I'll take care of it tomorrow," Marco said. "You better. And stop this foolishness with restaurants. People are starting to talk about your food obsession. It makes you look weak." After his father hung up, Marco walked to his kitchen and opened the refrigerator. It was stocked with expensive delicacies, imported cheese, caviar, smoked salmon, champagne. All of it looked unappealing. He closed the door without taking anything. The next morning, Marco handled his father's business with the Morettis. He and Tony paid a visit to their main gambling operation, delivered a clear message about territorial boundaries, and collected a substantial amount of money in unpaid debts. It was routine work that required no violence, just the implied threat of it. But all day, Marco found himself thinking about pot roast. By evening, he was driving toward Mama Rosa's again, telling himself he was just curious about whether Thursday's special would taste as good as Elena had promised. The diner was busier than usual, filled with customers who had clearly come specifically for the pot roast. Marco had to wait for a table, something that never happened in the expensive restaurants where reservations were held for him, regardless of how full they were. When Elena finally seated him, she looked pleased, but not surprised. "I had a feeling you'd show up tonight. Is the pot roast really that good?" "You tell me." The pot roast arrived with roasted vegetables and a thick brown gravy that covered everything. The meat fell apart at the touch of Marco's fork, and the flavor was rich and deep. It tasted like Sunday dinners with family, though Marco had never actually experienced such a thing. Halfway through the meal, Elena slid into the seat across from him again. "Can I tell you something? You're different from most of the guys who come in here trying to impress me." "How so?" "Most guys order the most expensive thing on the menu and leave huge tips, thinking money will get my attention. You order based on what you actually want to eat, and you listen when I talk. That's rare." Marco realized that Elena thought he was trying to impress her. The idea hadn't consciously occurred to him, but maybe she was right. Maybe that's what he had been doing without realizing it. "Are you impressed?" he asked. Elena smiled. "I'm intrigued. There's something sad about you, but also something kind underneath all that intensity, like you're carrying around a lot of weight that isn't really yours." Her observation hit closer to home than Marco was comfortable with. He had been carrying his father's expectations, his family's reputation, and the weight of a violent lifestyle since he was old enough to understand what the Santini name meant. "What if I told you that the weight is exactly mine?" Marco asked. "That I chose this life and everything that comes with it? Then I'd say you can choose differently. People change all the time. They walk away from things that don't serve them anymore and find new paths. It's not that simple." Maybe not, but it's possible. As the evening wore on, the diner gradually emptied until only a few customers remained. Mama Rosa began cleaning the kitchen while Elena refilled coffee cups and wiped down tables. Marco watched her work, noting the care she took with even the smallest tasks. "Elena," he said when she returned to his table, "what would you say if I told you my family business wasn't exactly legal?" She paused in her wiping and looked at him seriously. "I'd say I already figured that out. Import-export companies don't usually pay their employees enough to afford $1,000 watches and hand-tailored clothes, and most legitimate businessmen don't carry themselves like they're expecting trouble around every corner." Marco was stunned. "You knew?" "I suspected. But it doesn't change who you are when you're sitting in that booth eating Mama Rosa's cooking. In here, you're just Marco, a guy who's searching for something he lost or never had to begin with. Doesn't it worry you, knowing what I probably do for a living?" Elena sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. "My dad was a cop for 25 years. He taught me that people are more complicated than their jobs or their mistakes. He also taught me to trust my instincts about who's dangerous and who's not. My instincts say you're not going to hurt me. Your instincts could be wrong. They could be, but I don't think they are." Marco left the diner that night with more questions than answers. Elena's acceptance of who he might be confused him. In his experience, people either feared him or tried to use him. Elena seemed to see past his reputation to something underneath, something he wasn't sure actually existed. Over the next 2 weeks, Marco found himself returning to Mama Rosa's every few days. Each time, Elena recommended something different, and each time, the food satisfied him in a way that expensive restaurants never had. The meatball soup on Mondays, the lasagna on Fridays, the simple grilled cheese and tomato soup when rain kept most customers away. More importantly, he found himself looking forward to his conversations with Elena. She told him about her family, her dreams, her fears about starting college. She shared stories about regular customers and Mama Rosa's kindness to people who couldn't always afford to pay for their meals. In return, Marco began sharing carefully edited versions of his own life. He talked about the pressure of living up to his father's expectations. He mentioned feeling trapped in a role he had never chosen for himself. He described the loneliness of being surrounded by people who feared him rather than knew him. Elena listened without judgment, offering insights that were both simple and profound. She suggested that maybe his eating problems weren't about the food itself, but about finding nourishment for a hungry soul. She wondered aloud if his search for the perfect meal was really a search for authentic experiences in a life full of artificial relationships. "Food is just fuel for the body," she said one evening as they sat in the empty diner after closing time. "But sharing a meal with someone you care about, that feeds something deeper." Marco realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was actually sharing meals instead of just eating alone while surrounded by bodyguards and business associates. Elena's presence transformed the simple act of eating into something meaningful. But the more time he spent at Mama Rosa's, the more complicated his life became. His father grew suspicious of his frequent absences. Tony and Sal exchanged worried glances when he insisted on going places alone. Other members of the organization began whispering about Marco's strange behavior. The situation came to a head on a Tuesday evening when Marco was finishing a bowl of Mama Rosa's famous beef stew. Elena was telling him about her acceptance letter to nursing school when the diner door opened and three men in expensive suits walked in. Marco recognized them immediately. Carlo Moretti and two of his enforcers. They had been testing the Santini family's patients for weeks, and their presence here was no coincidence. Elena noticed Marco's sudden tension. "Friends of yours?" she asked quietly. "Not exactly." Carlo approached their table with a cold smile. "Marco Santini. Funny finding you in a place like this." The few remaining customers in the diner suddenly found reasons to leave, sensing the dangerous undercurrent in the air. Mama Rosa emerged from the kitchen, her face worried. "We need to talk," Carlo said, gesturing toward the door. Marco stood slowly, his mind racing. Carlo's presence here meant someone had been watching him, following his movements. Elena and Mama Rosa were now in danger simply because he had brought his world into theirs. "Outside," Marco agreed, hoping to draw the threat away from the innocent people in the diner. But as they reached the door, Carlo's smile grew wider. "Actually, I think we should talk right here, in front of your new friends. They should know exactly who they're dealing with." The tension in the small diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. Carlo Moretti stood near the entrance, blocking the exit, while his two enforcers positioned themselves strategically around the room. Marco could see Elena's face had gone pale, but she remained seated in the booth, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You know, Marco," Carlo said, his voice carrying false friendliness, "your father and I have been having some disagreements lately. Territory disputes, you understand. But maybe we can work something out." Marco kept his expression neutral, though his mind was working rapidly. Carlo wouldn't have come here just to talk business. This was a power play, designed to humiliate Marco in front of people who had come to matter to him. "This isn't the place for business discussions," Marco said quietly. Carlo laughed. "Oh, but I think it is. See, I've been watching you, Marco. Every Tuesday and Thursday, sometimes more often. Coming to this little dump, eating peasant food, talking to the help." His eyes fixed on Elena with an unpleasant smile. "Very touching, really." Mama Rosa stepped forward from behind the counter, her small frame somehow commanding despite the dangerous men filling her restaurant. "Gentlemen, if you have business to discuss, please take it outside. This is a family establishment." One of Carlo's men moved toward Mama Rosa, but Marco stepped sideways, putting himself between them. "Leave her out of this." "Leave her out of it?" Carlo's voice rose. "Marco, you're the one who brought your business here. You're the one who put these people in the middle of our world. I'm just making sure they understand the situation." Elena suddenly stood up from the booth. Marco wanted to tell her to stay seated, to make herself as small as possible, but before he could speak, she walked directly toward Carlo. "Excuse me," she said politely, "but you're frightening my customers. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Carlo stared at her in amazement. "Did this little waitress just tell me to leave?" "I'm asking nicely," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the obvious danger. "But if you refuse, I'll call the police." Marco's heart nearly stopped. Elena had no idea what she was dealing with. Men like Carlo had been bribing and intimidating police for decades. Her threat was not only useless, it was likely to make the situation much worse. Carlo's smile turned predatory. "The police? Oh, sweetheart, you really don't understand what's happening here, do you?" He reached inside his jacket, and Marco knew exactly what he was reaching for. Everything seemed to slow down as Marco calculated distances, angles, and possibilities. He was unarmed, outnumbered, and had two innocent people to protect. But before Carlo could draw his weapon, the diner door burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. Tony and Sal entered quickly, followed by three other men Marco recognized as his father's most trusted soldiers. The dynamic in the room shifted immediately. Carlo's confident smile faded as he realized he was now outnumbered. His two enforcers tensed, hands moving toward their own weapons, but they hesitated when they saw the firepower that had just walked through the door. "Gentlemen," Tony said calmly, "Mr. Vincent wants to see everyone. Now." Carlo straightened his jacket and tried to regain his composure. "Of course. We were just having a friendly conversation with young Marco here." "The conversation is over," Sal announced. "Time to go." As the men filed out of the diner, Carlo paused next to Elena's table. "It was lovely meeting you, miss. I hope we'll have the chance to chat again soon." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Marco felt a cold fury building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm until all the men were gone. When the door finally closed behind them, the diner fell silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside. Mama Rosa sank into a chair, her face gray with shock. Elena remained standing, but Marco could see her hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. "Elena," Marco began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't," she said quietly. "Just don't say anything right now." Marco wanted to explain, to apologize, to somehow make this right. But he knew there were no words that could undo what had just happened. He had brought his violent world into Elena's peaceful sanctuary, and now both she and Mama Rosa were in danger because of him. His phone buzzed, a text message. "Come home now. We need to talk." Marco looked at Elena one more time, memorizing her face, knowing this might be the last time he saw her. Then he walked out of the diner and climbed into the Mercedes where Tony was waiting. The drive to his father's compound took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Marco stared out the window at the city lights, thinking about Elena's brave stand against Carlo and Mama Rosa's dignity in the face of obvious threats. These were good people who deserved better than to be dragged into his family's brutal world. Vincent Santini was waiting in his study, a large room dominated by dark wood paneling and expensive artwork that had been acquired through various questionable means over the years. He was sitting behind his massive desk, his gray hair perfectly styled, his cold eyes studying his son with obvious displeasure. "Sit down, Marco." Marco took the chair across from his father's desk, the same chair he had occupied countless times over the years for lectures about responsibility, loyalty, and the Santini family reputation. "Carlo Moretti came to see me tonight," Vincent began. "He told me an interesting story about finding my son playing house with a waitress in some dive diner." "It's not what you think." "Really? Then explain to me what it is. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like my heir is compromising our family's security for some girl who serves coffee and pie." Marco had rehearsed this conversation in his mind many times, but now that it was happening, he found himself struggling for words. How could he explain to his father that Elena and Mama Rosa represented everything good that was missing from his life? "I've been eating there," Marco said finally. "The food is different." Vincent's eyebrows rose. "Different how?" "It actually tastes like something. For the first time in years, I can eat a meal and feel satisfied instead of disappointed." His father stared at him for a long moment, then started laughing. It wasn't a pleasant sound. "You're telling me that you've been jeopardizing our family's safety for meatloaf and mashed potatoes?" "It's more than that." "Then explain it to me, because I'm having trouble understanding how my son, who was raised to take over this organization, can be so reckless over some short-order cook and her waitress." Marco took a deep breath. "What if I don't want to take over the organization?" The silence that followed was deafening. Vincent's face went through several expressions before settling on cold anger. "What did you just say?" "I said, what if I don't want this life? What if I want something different?" Vincent stood up slowly, his hands flat on the desk. Different? You want different? Let me tell you about different, Marco. Different is working 18 hours a day in a factory for minimum wage. Different is worrying about paying rent and buying groceries. Different is having no power, no respect, no protection from the wolves that run this world. Maybe I'd rather be one of the sheep than one of the wolves. The words hung in the air between them. Marco had never spoken to his father this way, had never challenged the fundamental assumptions of their family's way of life. Vincent walked around the desk and stood directly in front of his son. You think that little waitress would want you if she knew who you really are? If she knew about the blood on your hands, the lives you've ruined, the fear you've caused? You think her precious little diner would welcome you if they knew you were Vincent Santini's son? Elena already knows. She figured it out weeks ago. And she still talks to you? She's either very stupid or very smart. Either way, she's dangerous. Marco stood up to face his father. She's neither stupid nor dangerous. She's just good. Something I'd forgotten existed. Good doesn't survive in our world, Marco. Good gets eaten alive. If you care about this girl, you'll stay away from her before someone uses her to get to you. Or to me. The threat was clear. Marco knew his father well enough to understand that Vincent would not hesitate to eliminate any perceived weakness in his organization, even if that weakness was his own son's feelings for an innocent woman. What do you want me to do? I want you to forget about the diner, forget about the waitress, and start acting like the man I raised you to be. We have a war coming with the Morettis, and I need to know my son is focused on family business, not playing Romeo with some nobody. Marco nodded slowly, knowing he had no choice. I understand. Good. Now go home and get some sleep. Tomorrow we start planning our response to Carlo's little visit tonight. He made a mistake threatening what's mine, and he's going to pay for it. As Marco left his father's study, he felt something breaking inside him. The brief taste of normal life he had experienced at Mama Rosa's was over. Elena and Mama Rosa would be safer without him, but he would be returning to a life that felt increasingly empty and meaningless. The next 3 weeks were a blur of violence and strategy as the Santini organization prepared for all-out war with the Morettis. Marco threw himself into the work with a dedication that pleased his father, but left him feeling hollow inside. He collected debts with extra brutality, intimidated witnesses with cold efficiency, and planned attacks with ruthless precision. But every night, he lay awake thinking about Elena's smile and Mama Rosa's chicken soup. He wondered if Elena missed him, if she understood why he had disappeared, if she was safe from the fallout of Carlo's visit to the diner. 3 times Marco drove past Mama Rosa's kitchen, but he never stopped. The first time, he saw Elena through the window, serving customers with the same gentle efficiency he remembered. The second time, the diner was closed, and he wondered if business had suffered after that terrible Tuesday night. The third time, Elena was outside sweeping the front steps, and she looked up just as his Mercedes passed by. Their eyes met for just a moment through the tinted glass, and Marco saw something in her expression that nearly made him tell Sal to stop the car, but he drove on, knowing that stopping would only put her in more danger. The war with the Morettis came to a head on a cold Friday night in November. Marco and his father's soldiers ambushed Carlo and his men outside a warehouse on the docks, ending the territorial dispute with decisive violence. Carlo himself was killed in the firefight, along with 2 of his top lieutenants. As Marco stood over Carlo's body, he felt none of the satisfaction he had expected. The man who had threatened Elena was dead, but Marco's problems were far from over. There would always be another Carlo, another threat, another violent solution to maintain the family's power. Walking away from the warehouse, Marco made a decision that had been building in his mind for weeks. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text message to Tony. "Tell my father I'll be back in a few hours." Then he told Sal to drive him to Mama Rosa's kitchen. The diner was officially closed, but Marco could see lights on in the back and movement through the windows. He knocked on the door and waited, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the violence he had just escaped. Elena opened the door, and her face went through surprise, relief, and something that might have been anger before settling on cautious welcome. "Marco," she said simply. "I know I shouldn't be here," he began, but she held up her hand to stop him. "You're right. You shouldn't be. Do you have any idea what the last 3 weeks have been like? The questions from police, the reporters asking about organized crime connections, the customers who stopped coming because they were afraid." Marco felt each word like a physical blow. "I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." "But it did happen. And then you disappeared without a word, leaving us to deal with the aftermath alone." Behind Elena, Mama Rosa appeared in the doorway. The elderly woman looked frailer than Marco remembered, but her eyes were still sharp and intelligent. "Let him in, Elena," Mama Rosa said quietly. "A man doesn't come back to face the music unless he has something important to say." Elena stepped aside reluctantly, and Marco entered the diner that had become the only place in the world where he felt like himself. The familiar smells of coffee and cooking oil surrounded him, but the atmosphere was different now. The innocence was gone, replaced by the knowledge of who he really was and what his presence meant. "I came to tell you that I'm leaving," Marco said without preamble. "My father's organization, this life, all of it. I'm walking away." Elena stared at him. "You can't just walk away from something like that. People do it. They disappear, start over somewhere else, become someone new. And then what? You think you can just show up here in 6 months and pick up where we left off?" Marco shook his head. "No. I know I can't ask you to be part of this. I can't ask you to wait while I figure out how to become someone worthy of your time. I just wanted you to know that meeting you changed everything for me. You showed me what I was missing, what I was hungry for all these years." Elena's expression softened slightly. "Marco, I also want to make sure you and Mama Rosa are protected. There's money in this envelope, enough to repair any damage to your business, enough to make sure you're safe if anyone else comes around asking questions." He placed a thick envelope on the nearest table. Elena stared at it like it was a snake. "We don't want your money." "Take it anyway. Please, it's the only way I can live with myself." Mama Rosa stepped forward and picked up the envelope. "Money is money, Elena, and we can use it to help people who need it." Elena looked from the envelope to Marco's face and back again. "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet. Somewhere far away from here. Somewhere I can learn to be the kind of man you see in me instead of the man I've been." "And your father will just let you walk away?" Marco smiled grimly. "My father thinks I'm having a breakdown over the stress of the war with the Morettis. He's sending me on a vacation to recover. I'll disappear during the vacation and never come back." Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if memorizing it. "What if you can't do it? What if you try to change and discover that you can't escape who you are? Then at least I'll know I tried. That's more than I could say yesterday." Elena suddenly reached across the space between them and took his hand. Her fingers were warm and strong, and Marco felt the same sense of rightness he had experienced the first time he tasted Mama Rosa's cooking. "I believe you can do it," she said quietly. "I've watched you eat here for months, and I've seen the man you could be underneath all that anger and violence. You're stronger than you think." Marco squeezed her hand gently, then let go. "Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for everything." He turned to leave, but Elena called his name. When he looked back, she was smiling through tears he hadn't noticed before. "When you become that man, the one you're meant to be, come back and have dinner with me. I'll save you a seat." Marco nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Then he walked out of Mama Rosa's kitchen and into the cold night, knowing he would never be the same person who had first pushed through that door 2 months ago. 6 months later, Elena received a postcard from Oregon. On the front was a picture of a small coastal town surrounded by forests and mountains. On the back, in careful handwriting, were 4 words: "Learning to cook. Miss you." She pinned the postcard to the bulletin board behind the counter, next to the thank you notes from regular customers and photos of Mama Rosa's family. Every day she looked at it and smiled, imagining Marco somewhere far away, discovering what it meant to nourish others instead of threatening them. 1 year later, a second postcard arrived, this one from Colorado. "Opened a small restaurant. Food tastes like home now." Elena showed the postcard to Mama Rosa, who nodded approvingly. "A man who learns to cook learns to love," the old woman said. "He'll be back when he's ready." And 18 months after Marco Santini walked out of her diner, Elena was closing up on a quiet Tuesday night when she heard a familiar knock on the door. She opened it to find a man who looked like Marco but seemed somehow lighter, more at peace with himself. "I hear you saved me a seat," he said, and his smile was genuine this time, free of the cold intensity she remembered. Elena stepped aside to let him in, and together they sat in the booth where their story had begun, sharing a simple meal and talking about the future they might build together, one honest conversation at a time.